All right. Welcome back to the brain injury discussion. This is your host, Jay. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what happens after a brain injury, specifically those invisible symptoms that maybe we don't recognize or see right away after a brain injury. Or maybe we're talking about those things that happen after a brain injury. But with that being said, I would definitely appreciate it if you like this video. We do appreciate it when we get that feedback. We'd also appreciate that feedback in the form of a comment. Maybe there's a subject you want us to talk about. Maybe there's an interesting source, or we'd love for people to engage in the conversation. Also, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It's doesn't cost you anything, but it really helps out the channel. And we try to put out this information weekly. We try to keep it informative and educational, but also applicable. So, with that being said, we're going to talk a little bit about what happens after a brain injury and what we might not see right away. So, we have a lot to get into. So, let's get started. So, first, we need to understand these invisible injuries. Some people call the brain injury or a TBI or a stroke. There are certain things that are visible, right? Like we see in this graphic, someone here hit their head. Not uncommon, but maybe there are some invisible injuries that maybe we aren't seeing right away. Maybe there's a change that happens, and usually, like we see in this point here, it can be a very unique array of symptoms that can vary. Again, that array of symptoms can be very wide reaching. And this can include physical changes. We see this quite often with like strokes, maybe blows to the head, maybe someone lost their balance or maybe they lost, maybe part of their vision. That stuff can happen from brain injury. So we can see physical, but maybe there's also emotional changes. Maybe there's a change in how they process certain situations that causes different emotions. Maybe they're more emotional, maybe they're less emotional, maybe they're despondent. Who knows? And every brain injury is unique. You're probably going to hear me say that a lot. There might also be intellectual and cognitive changes as well. And this can also reach into social symptoms. Maybe they're prior to the brain injury, they were engaging in a crowd of people, and maybe after the brain injury, maybe they're a little secluded. Maybe they're overwhelmed by the noise. And that is actually something that we can see after a traumatic brain injury. Again, these changes can be very far reaching. It can go into someone's social or maybe interpersonal life. Someone, again, after a brain injury, they might change a little, they might have these changes. And again, those changes might not necessarily be visible right away because obviously we can't physically see the brain. It's behind the skin, behind the skull, behind the dura mater. But we can see what happens if we're observant. And this can go into relationships and it can also go into community integration. Maybe there was a club, like a veteran who liked to go to the American Legion and hang out with other veterans. And then maybe, let's say, a car accident happens, and then all of a sudden they're not up to feeling it. Maybe they're tired. Maybe uh, that is an example of how a brain injury affects someone's community integration. Maybe they're active in like a church or a social club, and then maybe after that brain injury, they're just not up to it. Maybe they feel fatigued, or maybe it doesn't like, maybe they don't have the energy or um, the mental stamina to participate in those things, and those things can happen. And so we need to be aware of these things. You'll hear me say it over and over again, but each brain injury is unique to the person. Again, we are a person centered company. We don't try to fit people into molds, we try to mold it around the person. Um, what we see is that each person deals with the side effects differently. Again, uh, brain injury makes, it's a unique thing to the person. Even the same brain injury, like if we compare two people who are in the same car accident, their invisible injuries might be different from each other. Maybe they handle things differently. Uh, maybe there's other changes that happens, and we got to be aware of that as a brain injury case manager. We can't just fit people into a box. Every case is unique. So let's move on and let's talk about repeated head trauma. Again, what we see with repeated head trauma, we see a lot of mental health sequelae or side effects. I use that term. I like that term personally, but we see a lot of mental health with multiple blows on the head. Think about your the football players who maybe are disinhibited. Think about veterans who have been around a lot of blast injuries or were in some training accidents. Think about people who were in some car accidents. Um, that's or maybe industrial accidents. Those are things to consider. But repeated head trauma tends to lead to mental health sequelae, which includes depression, anxiety, and as well as other neuropsychological problems. Again, the brain is where the emotions are processed. And so when we see continued head blows, think about that boxer. Um, think about someone who, engages in one of those professions where brain injury is quite common. um, those multiple head blows can lead to changes in the brain, literal changes in how the brain operates. Even though we're not, it would be different to see. Maybe you'd see the change under SPECT, but we see that with multiple head trauma. We see this a lot in military, in sports like football, soccer, and hockey, where with those multiple head blows, there's changes to the limbic system. That's where the emotions are processed. And then we also see that there can be changes to the frontal lobe as well as other locations. But with the frontal lobe, you have that executive functioning. And so this area of the brain controls your inhibition or puts the guardrails, or some might call it a filter. And so maybe after that brain injury, maybe that filter is maybe not there. Maybe it's not as thick. Maybe the filter's not working. And so we got to be understanding and cognizant of that if you're working with someone with brain injury. Also, when we see repeated head trauma, we see something called CTE, and we see these things kind of devolve in latter stages of CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Shout out to the Concussion Legacy Foundation. I'll put the link for them below. But CTE is a very serious thing. We see this a lot in head injury sports like football, which is where it really got started. But then you also see it in dangerous professions like the military, where head trauma is common. And so things we should be aware when it comes to repeated head trauma, maybe we should prevent further head trauma. So let's continue and let's talk about, instead of repeated head trauma, let's talk about young head trauma. Let's talk about head injury symptoms for someone who's young, maybe a child, maybe an adolescent. What we see is that when a young lady, young man, or a lad, or an adolescent, maybe a child, when they get head injuries, it usually causes damage to the developing brain. Your brain doesn't finish developing until you're really in your mid 20s, so mostly 25, right? And so if you get a blow to the head before that age, especially when the brain is really developing, like the ages of 2 to 7, we start seeing changes. We start seeing stunted development. And this will lead to cognitive and emotional developmental delays, or maybe they don't even reach that point after a big brain injury. And those are things that, again, parents, again, this is why I stress prevention. If someone who is young, let's say they're adolescent, child, and they get a brain injury, usually this will affect school and social life. Maybe they're going to be a little bit more despondent. Maybe they need to take more time on assignments in class. And so, for the teachers out there, this might be useful for you to know and to understand, because maybe it's not the student, maybe it's the brain injury that is taking more time on assignments, that maybe is struggling on tests, maybe needs a quieter environment, away from more stress and all that. Maybe that is a solution there. I'm not an educator myself, but those are things that we can work with if someone, like, for example, a parent of that child who's had a brain injury and the teacher can work together to help address these invisible injuries. Especially with children and adolescents, the environmental factors are important. You want good stimulation on the brain. You want good learning for the brain. You want to develop that brain naturally, and also you want it to develop safely, which again leads me to kind of most of my points in these videos is that prevention is the key. If a young child or an adolescent is going on a bike ride, tell them to wear a helmet. If they're going out to play sports, maybe not put them in tackle football right away. Um, if they're going to play soccer, maybe don't headbutt the ball because that can cause head trauma, even if they don't realize it. Same thing with hockey, same thing with a lot of sports. And also, car seats, have the appropriate car seat for your child in the case of that car accident, which again, some car accidents happen, not your fault necessarily. So, prevention is the key. We want to keep the developing brains healthy and safe. So let's continue. Let's talk about more understanding. When someone gets a brain injury, and sometimes these things uh, can very well can I stress can be very well a long-term thing, which leads into lifelong battles. Brain injuries with veterans, especially, they tend to get blast waves, which damage the limbic system, which you know works with emotion, and maybe they're not processing emotion. That might be an explanation as to why PTSD is so high in the veteran community. Same thing with sports, and these, sports, not just on your physical body, but also your cognitive, your emotions, your brain. And so these are lifelong battles. There is no cure for brain injury, there's no magic drug for it. Now, in some cases, we can see improvement. Again, that could be from a number of different factors. Could be environmental, it could be, helpfulness, maybe change in diet, maybe increasing nutrients to the brain, maybe better habits. But we can also see deterioration as well. And that deterioration can happen, especially with the multiple head trauma. We also see that when someone has a brain injury, we see increased cognitive and emotional burdens. Maybe that's someone uh, who could sit through a 8-hour day at work. Maybe they struggle afterwards. That's an example of cognitive and emotional burden. Maybe they feel wore out after what was prior to the brain injury, a normal day. Or maybe they feel much more drained afterwards. And we have to be understanding of that. And again, with head trauma, generally speaking, especially with moderate to severe TBI, you see an increased risk for degenerative disease. And so the sooner you find this, again, this can be invisible for a number of years, but the sooner you find it, the sooner you can address it, especially before it goes into the latter stages. We're talking types of dementia, maybe Alzheimer's, and we also see cognitive decline. And if you are in the field of medicine or clinical medicine, you might see the term MCI, which is mild cognitive impairment. Um, we need to be careful with our brains. And that's why I emphasize prevention and protection, really. If you're going to engage in football or sports, wear the proper PPE properly. Same thing with the military. Like if you wore your helmet, make sure you fasten that chin strap. Make sure that it fits properly, that it's not too big, too small, and that you can wear it and it will protect you. Same thing goes with bicycle riding. When you're operating a motor vehicle, click that seat belt. It's that simple to prevent and protect your brain. So, what does this lead me to conclude as a brain injury case manager? For brain injury, there's really no cure, but each are different and unique to the person. Again, there's no magic cure for brain injury. Otherwise, people like me wouldn't need to be around. And so, brain injury is unique and different to every person, and there's no one size fits all solution. These symptoms can sometimes be very hard to spot. Again, they might take years to really show. And so we need to be cognizant of those slight little changes if and when they happen. And so understanding is important. And that leads me to that next point, which is being cognizant of these changes, being aware that these things can, in fact, happen, right? And again, this is a wide range of different symptoms that again might be just ever so slight, a 1% change. We need to understand these changes, not just know that they exist, but let's understand what caused them. That brain injury 20 years ago can lead to things that happen now. And obviously, being a very person centered case manager, person-centered company, really, we emphasize that because every brain injury is unique. We need to plan around the person and not just the brain injury. What does that really mean in practice? That means we develop the plan around the person, and we do consider that brain injury, hey, this happens, but it's the person, not the injury. Let's help the person and not just think about just that brain injury. So, with that being said, I think that'll conclude it for here. Here are my references. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. I hope you all protect your brains. References will be in the sources below, but also they're good resources in the case if you want to further your education. But we'd appreciate it if you like this video. We appreciate that feedback. And we'd also like feedback in the form of comments, maybe a good discussion in the comments section. That would be very useful. And also subscribe to the channel. We put out this information weekly. We try to keep it informative, educational, but also applicable to a wide variety of fields. But with that being said, have a wonderful day, everybody. And don't forget, protect your brains.